Priscilla is a 2023 biopic written and directed by Sofia Coppola and based on the novel Elvis and Me. What's notable about this project is that it's the second mainstream film regarding the life of Elvis Presley in 2 years, as in 2022 we got Elvis, directed by Luhrmann and starring Austin Butler and Tom Hanks. Although the goals of each movie are entirely different. As the titles obviously suggest, Elvis is from his perspective, whereas Priscilla's is from hers. And while the two films are pretty fundamentally different, if you're going to try and get an understanding of the lives of Elvis and Priscilla Presley, Priscilla does a significantly better job. After watching Priscilla, it feels like the story we should have gotten when the first one came out. Now, before anyone comments something like, Elvis tried telling his complete story, whereas Priscilla only really focused on key points of their lives, so it's not fair to compare them, I suggest you go back to your full-time job of whining on Twitter. Yes, the two films are different from each other in a plethora of ways. However, there are several similarities where you can directly compare the two. So while they may be different, they still have plenty of comparisons. And the goal of this video isn't to praise one while demonizing the other, it's to show that when dealing with basically the same subject matter, there are different ways to approach it which may be more effective than others. Like the casting characters, which I'm mainly going to be focusing on. Luhrmann's Elvis was pretty successful financially, and a lot of that had to do with who was in it. Austin Butler has been a rising star for years, and while yes, appearance-wise he looks basically nothing like the real Elvis, he's proven himself to be a solid enough actor, and at the end of the day, the performance is really what matters the most. His role in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really showed off that he could transition out of being just a Nickelodeon kid. And while I did like his performance overall as he really held a lot of the movie together, I would not say he captured the spirit of Elvis. So much of the discussion around him came from how he was able to accurately do all the Elvis moves, as well as how he may have permanently messed up his voice because he still talks like Elvis. I swear to God, if I read one more sob story article about how he still talks that way, I'm gonna start screaming. He wears these terrible wigs and poses constantly throughout the movie. Yes, it's a fun performance and I liked a lot of the character details it gave, but it's not really deeper than just trying to portray the real guy. That kind of goes into the bigger issue with rock biopics, but I don't really want to go into that now. Whereas Jacob Elordi, who plays Elvis and Priscilla, resonates much more. On top of looking more like the real guy, he provides a performance that is nuanced when it needs to be and honestly comes across a lot less show-offy. I think he also benefited from just having a good script also. Like the opening scene is this guy who comes up to Priscilla and offers her an invitation to one of Elvis's parties. The way she reacts implies just how big of a figure he was at the time. That's a very effective way to add depth without hitting you over the head with it. There are mystery elements that imply things we aren't seeing. And that's a good time to bring up the Colonel. Tom Hanks played him in Elvis, and I don't understand what they were going for here. Okay, first off, they make him out to be this beyond evil villain who manipulates Elvis at every turn. And while that is true to a certain extent in real life, they hit you over the head with it so hard it starts to just not make sense. Also, Tom Hanks' performance was just awful. I'm sorry. I don't know what they were thinking with this interpretation.
Something so everyone can show their love. Grandma told you, what is that behind your ear?
He sounds like a rejected Sacha Baron Cohen character. And with the makeup always not looking that good, nothing about his character worked for me. Now, how was the Colonel and Priscilla? I couldn't tell you, he wasn't in it. We only ever hear him spoken about, or like Elvis talking to him over the phone. There's this very quick scene where someone points at a map which is kind of implied to be him, but again, we sparsely get a feel for who he is. Only that he has this control over Elvis. And in my opinion, this is a much more interesting approach than just flanderizing the original guy. This kind of goes into the roles they play into Elvis himself. Both films add a layer of sympathy to Elvis since he's clearly being manipulated by a figure of authority, but the Luhrmann film takes it to an extreme, whereas Coppola's interpretation is much more nuanced. Luhrmann's version shows Elvis to be a generally well-intentioned guy who is always manipulated by other people. Coppola's is manipulated as well, however he does his fair share of unsavory shit himself. I think a lot of people might write off Coppola's as some sort of hit piece on Elvis, but that just isn't true. Do you really think a guy who so quickly reached stardom like no one had ever seen and had access to virtually everything he ever wanted wasn't going to have some ill intentions? Vernon Presley, Elvis's dad, is another example. In Luhrmann's version, he's nothing more than a punching bag that the Colonel manipulates, and while that is true to some extent, it's played to such an absurd degree that it's almost parodic. He does virtually nothing throughout the film except to again perpetuate how much of a big bad guy the Colonel is. He doesn't really play a major role in Priscilla, but he adds to the strict nature of the household that Priscilla finds herself in. Like talking about how strict he is with her money, or scolds her for entering the family office. He's another piece of the puzzle that brings Priscilla to her breaking point. Speaking of which, now let's take a look at Priscilla herself. Since it's obviously a movie about her, you'd hope we get a very nuanced interpretation of the character, and thankfully we do. But it's no easy feat to capture the essence of the same character at several different points in their life. She plays her over the course of like 14 years, and you buy her at age 14 all the way up to age 28. The right balance of makeup and wardrobe changes helps Spaney's understanding of how the character would act at different stages of her life. Whereas in Luhrmann's version, again, Priscilla hardly does much of anything throughout the film. Olivia DeJonge has like 3 standout scenes in the whole movie.
And then he said to me, you know what, Priscilla? You gotta listen to me, sweetie, because this guy, he's got girls all over the world, okay? He's got girls that are waiting outside of his house, and girls writing him endless fan mail.
And when they say goodbye at the end of the film, it tries to imply that they still love each other, but it was only the circumstances that merely got in the way. I'm not trying to imply Elvis and Priscilla didn't still love each other after the divorce to some degree. However, it's the film's attempt to try to have you sympathize with them even more. That fame and external forces drove his marriage into the ground. Also, don't forget how Luhrmann's film completely glosses over her being 14 when they met. This is an incredibly uncomfortable thing that actually happened, which the first film just completely glossed over, but hey, he's a nice guy. Nice guys don't take interest in 14-year-olds. So by this point, I think you can see the obvious differences between the two films. I pretty much just talked about the characters because Priscilla is a character-driven movie, whereas Elvis just isn't. I understand that if you hire Baz Luhrmann to direct your film, his main and, well, only concern is the spectacle. And it's not to say that it isn't felt. A lot of the costumes, set pieces, and music numbers were all very well done, and like I said, I did overall enjoy Austin's performance. But I'm not going to judge a movie solely on how much I enjoyed watching it. If it's surface level in its storytelling, I'm going to call it out for such. Priscilla doesn't really have the scale of Elvis, but it doesn't really need it. It gets its points across in similar ways with much more subtlety. Instead of these big elaborate music numbers, we get just a few ambiguous shots of Elvis dancing instead. The entire film is just another example of being less is more, and I got way more out of Priscilla while experiencing much less.